We're in Johannesburg, South Africa's largest city, where more than $1 billion of stocks are traded daily. Africa's economy is growing fast, second only to Asia. And yet almost half of the continent lives in extreme poverty. Globally, too, as wealth reaches new heights, a quarter of all young children still don't get enough to eat. Who's to blame? And is it time for radical solutions? Join me for this BBC World debate, Why Poverty? Hello from Johannesburg, I'm Zainab Badawi. We're talking poverty, inequality and why, despite all our advancements, technological progress and increasing wealth, this is a twin scourge which still plagues the 21st century. Our panel, Tony Blair, former British Prime Minister who counts his Africa Governance Initiative amongst his many pursuits and activities since leaving office. Oby Ezekwesili, former Nigerian government minister until recently. She headed the Africa Department at the World Bank and is now leading a new Africa Economic Initiative for the Soros Open Society Foundations. Vandana Shiva, a scientist and grassroots activist from India who champions the rights of small farmers and who is never afraid to speak passionately against prevailing ideas. And lastly, Maletsi Mbeki, South African author of Architects of Poverty, Why African Capitalism Needs Changing. He's also chair of the South African Institute of International Affairs. Also in the studio is an invited audience of business leaders, academics, activists, students, and people from diverse communities here in South Africa and also further afield. Welcome to our panel and our audience. Now, before we start our debate, let's look at an excerpt from a film. Together with this debate is part of a global event hosted by the BBC and 50 other broadcasters, reaching an audience of 500 million people. Why poverty?
Hello. One of these people are you. You've had a long day at school. Or was it the office? Now you are home. Relax. Maybe you want to watch television.
These people live in constant fear of eviction. They had already been forced out of previous slums.
In this place, people die so we can get mobile phones.
You've heard it all before, haven't you?
Children working as slaves.
You feel a mixture of sorrow and cynicism. The world is richer than it has ever been, and yet there seems to be more poor people than ever.
Economies have been on the edge of a financial and economic precipice.
You are falling asleep. You're going to have a strange dream.
Poverty history.
It starts with this thought. If we want to make poverty history, then first we need to understand the history of poverty.
Poverty, wealth, power, powerlessness are connected.
Now your soul floats over the world's early civilizations. See all the millions of little farmers with their little fields. Everything looks poor, except for the one or two palaces where the kings and chiefs lived. The era of colonialism has begun. The Spanish have conquered your country. You see your people are dying. World wars come and go. There's even a Great Depression. But you still feel things are getting better.
There was an idea called trickle-down economics. If you could just get the economy to grow, everybody would benefit. Sometimes a rising tide lifts all boats. That's nonsense. There's been a remarkable increase in inequality, very marked declines of people at the bottom.
Poverty is on the way out, slowly but surely. There are fewer people who live under $1 a day today than 5 years ago, than 5 years before, than 5 years before. It's very unequal in some countries more than others, but it's kind of happening.
You are appearing in a TV game show. It's called Who Wants to Be a Billionaire?
Who wants to be a billionaire? And now, the question for you on which the $1 billion prize rests. What reduces poverty today? Is it A, aid, B, communism, C, state spending, or D, globalization?
So, some sobering thoughts there in that film. Tony Blair, fundamentally, the main driver of poverty is greed and inequality.
Inequality of opportunity, certainly. I mean, that's the big reason why so many people are poor, if they don't get the opportunity to lift themselves out of poverty, to get a job, to get a standard of living. But I think there are two big things that have changed in this debate that are very important for us to notice. The first is that despite the fact that there is still huge numbers of people, over 1 billion people who live in abject poverty, actually over this past 20 years, we have seen almost 1 billion people lifted out of poverty as well. Now, it's true a lot of that has come from China, and the huge number, over 600 million people lifted out of poverty there, but also in Latin America, also indeed in parts of Africa. So, it's not that the situation has not had any improvement at all. When we think back on the G8 summit that I chaired, and we then had the debt relief and the increases in aid and so on, plus the fact that has been some real economic growth. 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world in the past few years have been in Africa. There is progress. Secondly, however...
Can I just say, so as long as there's progress then, Tony Blair, it doesn't matter if you have a financial rich elite.
No, of course it does.
It does matter.
It does matter, absolutely, because if you end up with a closed circle at the top who keep other people out, that is not just bad for poverty, it's bad for the economy. But the second thing that I would say has changed is that I think we know a lot better today what actually works to create effective paths out of poverty. And that is all to do with the quality of governance. And I think the single biggest challenge we face right now is for governments to be able to take the steps necessary on things like infrastructure, electricity, power, education, and growth.
We'll look at that in a moment. But Vandana, is it just, as Tony Blair says, a lack of equality of opportunities that's holding people down?
Well, I think what Tony said assumes that the pathetic people lying out there and you've got to give them a rope and pull them out. The reality is people are pushed to poverty. The original state of human beings is not poverty. In the Amazon, people aren't poor in the sense they're not deprived. They have their food, they have fresh water, they have a rich culture, they have medicine, their own medicinal plants. Poverty is created first by grabbing the resources of the people. Africa, a continent whose poverty is deeply linked to the appropriation of land, historically and today, the biggest land grab taking place in history, is creating new poor people. But new poverty is being created in the heart of affluence, in Europe, in America.
But I mean, does it really matter? If you look at the OECD countries, people there have got a reasonable standard of living and have had for a long time, and yet there is also inequality. So does it matter as long as people are lifted out of poverty where there are just a few getting rich?
Well, the point is, we are living in times where the new wealth is highly concentrated in a few people's hands, and there is a new language of oligarchy emerging. Now, in my country, I've analyzed the handful of new oligarchs who've made it to the 10 top billionaires, grabbed the land of the people, benefited from the privatization of electricity, so poor people have lost access to electricity.
So the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer as a result? Are you seeing a clear link there?
It's totally interconnected, because if water is privatized, of course one company makes more wealth, but people get cholera because they lost their access to drinking water. If seed is patented and privatized, 250,000 Indian farmers commit suicide. Debt.
I think the figure is what, 270,000 have killed themselves over the last 15 years.
Debt, all related to mechanisms of creating wealth by taking away the commons of the people.
Just sticking on this specific point then, I mean, Obi, do you agree with Vandana that if the power is concentrated and the wealth in the hands of just a few people, that it means that the vast majority at the bottom are going to become impoverished? And if you look at Nigeria, what's the figure that the World Bank had not that long ago? 1% of the population enjoy about 80% of the country's wealth. derived mostly from oil?
You know, Zainab, I think that the most important thing is a focus on how we can ensure that there's better distribution of the benefits of growth. However, the right point that she makes is that we must be mindful of the fact that if the poor are stuck in pernicious poverty, while a very insignificant percentage of people continue to do better, the society sows a seed for its own implosion.
Moletsi and Becky, when you look at South Africa, where we are here, it's the most unequal country in the world now. And that's what's happening here, isn't it? There are more and more people becoming impoverished in what is, by rights, a very rich country in terms of natural resources.
Well, actually, in South Africa, we're getting people at the bottom who are rising. And a big part of that is due to redistribution, like Ovi is saying, of social welfare programs. However, at the top end, 10% of the population, its share of the national income is getting higher and higher and higher. So, yes, South Africa is very unequal, but there are those caveats which I have to introduce.
I mean, Tony Blair, when you say that we need equality of opportunity, it sounds like we need more than that, really. We need a kind of... Nobody's arguing for equality of outcome. Everybody accepts that, you know, there are always going to be people who are richer than the others. But you do expect a kind of reasonable equality, and it sounds like we're not really getting that, don't you think?
You know, of course, but let's be clear. When we talk about equality of opportunity, I mean, that's not the be-all and end-all, but it's a huge start. Because the fact is, for many people in the poorest countries, they have no opportunity. But the interesting thing, because we can all sit here and say, look, poverty's terrible and it's awful and so on and so forth. The question is, what do we do? And that's why I focus so much of what I do now on governance, because I really do believe that if governments take the right decisions, if you have, for example, no corruption in government, right? Corruption is a huge problem. If you have proper rule of law, if you have government investing in infrastructure, technology today is transferable. If countries have electricity and power, if children have access to technology, there's a huge amount of opportunity that comes with that. So all I'm saying is when you look at this issue of poverty, the critical answer is to say, why is it that actually there have been some improvements, and how do we now take this to the next level?
All right. Vandana?
Yeah, I think to begin with the argument of opportunity, when the beginning of poverty, the root of poverty and the root of absolutely obnoxious wealth in concentrated form, the 1%, 99% that the Occupy movement refers to, ignores the fact that opportunities are deliberately being closed for people, creating a new poverty. When you take away the land that a farmer can use to provide food for their family, that's a source of poverty. When you privatize water, electricity, that's closing the opportunity. And I think the injustice built into the idea of creating a new growth by commodifying that which was accessible to people in their resources, in their livelihoods, in their commons, in their public systems, that I think is vital, because growth everyone is now talking about as a mismeasure. It doesn't talk about how the growth was created, how many forests did you destroy, and the fact that instead of a trickle down, we have a grab up.
I don't think it's just a matter of saying, look, there are these nasty people at the top who do this here and everyone else has their resources grabbed off them.
But Tony, it's not about nasty people up there. It's a nasty process that entrenches
It sounded
injustice.
like you were saying there were nasty people at the top, though. Not all rich people are nasty, are they?
I don't think they have to be
Some
extra
create
bad
wealth.
when the system allows them to grab the resources
question
of the people. But I think the most important issue really is this. India, like China, has had very high growth figures. In this period of high growth, India beat Africa in the number of hungry people. We become the Republic of Hunger. Why? Because land was taken from people. Why? Because our public universal system of food distribution was destroyed.
We'll come to food in more detail, Vandana, but Obi wants to come in here and then I'd like to go to the audience.
I think the point I would like to make is that...
To whom in particular?
To both of them, actually, because both of them are coming at it from angles that can find a common ground at some point.
You've got your mediator here, you see. That's great. You're the referee.
And the issue is, I think Vandana is making the point that the quality of growth matters, the structure of growth. What kind of growth are we fascinated by? The truth is, we have seen the limits of growth that is jobless, would not offer the opportunity for increased income, which is exactly what you need for the poor to be able to lift themselves out of poverty. So, that being the case, what we should be spending a lot of time trying to understand is how is it that we can diversify the sources of growth?
I think Ovi has put her finger on the problem of poverty. It's actually inequality of power. You have people with more power than the others, and therefore they have more access to the opportunities that Tony is talking about and to the resources that she is talking about. And in my own country, in South Africa, this is very, very clear. South Africa, in the middle of the 19th century, David Livingstone came here, and one of the things that struck him was the health of the African population. And David Livingstone was a doctor, and he pointed out that the South African black population is much, much healthier than the British population. Today, we are one of the most disease-ridden populations.
You've got the highest level of HIV/AIDS infection.
With HIV, with tuberculosis, with all sorts of infectious diseases because of inequality of power.
All right, Obi raised an interesting point, which I want to put to Norway's Deputy Development Minister, who is here in our audience. So is it very much that the Norwegian, indeed the Scandinavian model, is to have a high level of taxation whereby you redistribute money from the rich, whoever they are, to the poorer members of society?
Well, I think, first of all, the very fact that there is inequality in a society is a venom for society. It erodes trust between people, and the erosion of trust is also the beginning of the decline of the economy. And this is something that economists have now been left aside out of their economic models for years. And I think now they're starting to realize that trust is an integral part for a thriving economy. When it comes to Norway, I mean, there are two major ways of redistribution. One is employment. Another is taxation. We have a very high taxation level, and we do our best to try to redistribute that income. But if I can mention a third, which I think is even more important, and that's the issue of including women in the workforce. I mean, we see today, I mean, we're in an oil country, and we'll come back to that, but in Norway, we've calculated that the fact that 3 out of 4 Norwegian women are in the workforce means adding to the economy much more than the entire oil wealth, past, present, future of Norway. And that is the most important equality indicator.
We'll come to oil in a moment. I just want to come to the audience on this. Dipolo, you are an activist here in South Africa, and this issue of the need to have some kind of gender equality is vital in so many ways.
It is, but I also think that we need to be very clear on the structural origins of inequality, including gender inequality. We're very good in terms of talking about the figures of where women are not, but we need to understand that the labor market and international capital thrives on cheap labor, which is often women's labor. It thrives on surplus population. We also need to understand that international financial systems are, again, very unkind to women in terms of collateral, in terms of access to credit, in terms of any way of making meaningful contributions and input to the economy and becoming citizens in terms of economic agency. We cannot continue to be the recipients of largesse. We must be placed at the center of all considerations.
I totally agree that you are only going to be able to increase wealth if you involve all the workforce. I entirely agree with what the Minister was just saying about the role of women and so on. But I think we've got to have an honest conversation about this, really. The other reasons why Norway has done so well is because, for example, when it's had its resource wealth, it's actually put that in a fund that it has used then for the benefit of the country. It has a strong rule of law. It has a great education system. It has no corruption in government. And I don't think you can have this debate without looking at the countries that have succeeded over these past years. You know, you take South Korea. There's a country in the 60s that was in the same position as many countries in the poorest parts of the world. Why have they done so much better?
All right, let's just ask Obi here. I mean, Norway has, what do you tax for your oil companies? Something like 78%?
78.
Statoil and... Yeah. Obi, Nigeria, what's the taxation level for your oil corporations in Nigeria? It's not as high as 78%, let's face it.
You know, I think that even the larger story is... I think there's a point that Tony is trying to get at, which is that we need to begin to look at some of the constraints to inclusive growth, beneficial growth? Is it possible that poor quality of governance plays a significant role in excluding majority of people from the benefits of growth? Is it possible that just shoddy economic policies will exclude people from growth? Is it possible that not mindful of social inclusion as an important tool of public policy, that governments can be pretending that growth is happening when a larger majority of the citizens are excluded from it? But the point that we need to strike is that Africa's structure of economy has not reasonably or significantly changed from what it was at independence.
Yeah, but
and
that's
you
the
need
point.
the structure of the economy to change in order that it would take many more people in the process of its growth.
Because if you look at Nigeria, your own country, as you say, huge oil wealth, it's the biggest oil producer in sub-Saharan Africa, and yet the number of people who are living on $1 a day, $2 a day is actually increased. Where is your redistribution?
Your
you don't
redistribution.
tax people, you've got all that tax evasion, tax avoidance, capital flight.
Zainab, your redistribution happens at the level of government agency, and that's where the issue of governance comes in. Right. So you need to be able to redistribute in a way that natural resources translates to physical capital as well as intellectual or human capital, and that forms the basis for the kind of growth that is dispersed.
And you're telling them all that because you've been a cabinet minister and what hasn't happened. I want to ask, just if I may, David Fine, you're from McKinsey's. McKinsey did that fine report a couple of years ago or so on the future of African economies.
Thank you very much. And we've just published a report on the issue of inclusive jobs in Africa. I think first let's talk about the opportunity. Africa has a very large and young growing workforce. It's going to be the largest workforce in the world by 2035, larger than China, larger than India. And it's actually going to be reasonably educated. By 2020, our estimates are saying that 50% of people in Africa will have a secondary or tertiary education. The issue is the resources sector, which is 25% of GDP, only employs 1% of people. It's not going to solve the problem. Africa needs a job strategy, which is different from a growth strategy.
Okay, industrialization.
My name is Puleng Lenkabula. I'm from the University of South Africa. You cannot limit the idea of growth as the only criterion of determining whether a population or a country is poor or rich. And we have to understand that if we enter into the conversation on poverty, there must be other dimensions that are brought into the debate. Endogenous knowledge systems, training of people to articulate themselves and to determine the trajectories of life that they want, the valuing of the contributions of people towards the livelihood of societies. I'm a bit troubled sometimes when you talk about governance issues and corruption immediately jumps up in the context of Africa, because the debate never really reaches out. Who are the bribers when the bribed are allowed to actually exploit their own societies?
Talking, who is it in your view?
I'm giving an example.
But briefly, if you would, yes. Who are the bribers in your view? Briefly.
Some of the multinational companies are claiming themselves to be promoting economy or participating in Southern Africa. The whole cases of corruption in South Africa of the French companies buying opportunities.
Yeah, but you know now.
These are governance issues that we shouldn't disregard when we're talking, because we tend to think.
No, that's it. We get the point. But I mean, maybe there's somebody from the corporate world, but there are moves both in the United States and in the European Union to try to get greater transparency.
Iraj Abedian from Pan-African Investment and Research. I think the contrast between Nigeria and Norway got a bigger picture. I mean, up to 5-6 years ago, in terms of the World Bank report, 60% of sub-Saharan Africa's surplus left the continent. Never mind getting into a proper governance and getting into dealing with issues of poverty, it literally went to the ex-colonial centers. So the issues of governance is not just at the national level, but as you just alluded to, going beyond UK and US, we got to see what's happening to the global tax havens, what's happening to these surpluses that these resource companies, industrial companies, infrastructure companies are extracting from the poorer regions. And it evaporates into the tax havens.
Tony Blair, obviously a City of London. I know you're not Prime Minister anymore, but you're British. And the City of London is a huge financial centre, of course, and we have seen some scandals emerging from there. But some of this money surely ends up in Western capitals like in London.
No, of course it does. But I mean, just to say, by the way, there are now very tough laws in the US, in the UK and in Europe against corruption, and those laws are enforced. Secondly, actually, a lot of the extraction now is done via Asia, in fact, not simply via the West. But if you look at the problem for an African country, let's say, or take a developing country in Latin America, right? So you take a country like Brazil or like Colombia. It's got a big resource base. When they move to the next stage of development, they've then got to be making the goods with the raw materials in Brazil, in Colombia, in Africa, right? That is the objective. So the question is, how do you do that? And you don't do that unless you have A, an education system that is educating people for the skills they need, and B, a system of government encouraging the development of native business and enterprise that allows that whole value-added business sector to develop. And that's what lifts people out of poverty.
But Tony Blair, you've got your African Governance Initiative, and it's clear from the title what that means. But do you think you ought to perhaps have a European governance initiative?
Well,
particularly
we've got enough problems in Europe.
Corporations. No, but I have to. No. Oh, you're clapping me there, Obi.
And the point is, Tony's talking about the next stage of development. If the next stage of development of Europe is what we are seeing in Greece and Spain, then shouldn't Africa and Asia be thinking differently about the model of development? That's one.
Well,
and the second is to talk governance without talking democracy and people's rights. Sure. I think it's basically removing the foundations.
I want to just put
I'm not doing that.
Equality.
We're not all ganging up on you, Tony Blair.
I know,
but the point I'm
very happy to be in the position of... I'm used to it.
I was picking up the point that we had from the audience, which is, there's a very interesting thing from the European Union that $850 billion, euros rather, is lost in the European Union to tax evasion, which is illegal, and 150 billion euros lost in tax avoidance, which is legal, but sometimes barely legal. If you had all that, it would pay off all of the EU's debts handsomely. Well, so it isn't... That's why I say to you, do we need a European governance initiative?
Well, of course we need to take measures to crack down on tax evasion and so on and so forth. But, I mean, let's also be very clear that the issue for countries that are trying to develop now, I'm not saying that governance doesn't include democracy and civil rights. Of course it does. But that's all part of the same picture, which is if you want countries to grow and lift people out of poverty, then the system of governance, the policies that are pursued, effective implementation of policy is absolutely central. And that's the reason why countries, because we have examples, have moved in 30 years from being very poor countries to countries with a higher standard of living. So all I'm saying is a debate about poverty that ignores that dimension is the debate about poverty that isn't realistic.
So, for example, I would say that we need to build on what we have so far achieved. Say in Africa, we now know that Africa, over the last decade, has been able to grow at an average of 5% and above. What must we now do to improve that growth and to ensure that the benefits go to more?
I think you were going to reply to something that Tony Blair just said.
And what I want to say on that is that we must begin to look at the structure of the African economy. Agriculture is an important facet for poverty reduction.
OK, you bring us to agriculture, and that's something that we will turn to now, because, of course, when poverty is so extreme that it leads to hunger, it is the most worrying issue. As our global population, in fact, expands, agriculture, which provides a livelihood to 2.5 billion people, is lagging behind population growth. And the prospect of more starving people has led many experts to call for another green revolution by the use of technology, better seeds, fertilisers and, of course, capital. But although the issue of food security is vital, there is a vast disagreement on how it can be achieved, as this film shows.
Hungry and angry, another food riot breaks out on the streets in Algeria.
Struggling to buy the most basic of foodstuffs, these are desperate times.
Africa, known for its fertile land and low-priced agricultural real estate, has become the target of wealthy investors.
Nearly 60% of the world's available arable land is in Africa, and it's estimated that nearly half of the hungry people are also farmers.
So this is actually centered where the fields will be when we develop them.
Mima Nedeljkovic made his name building sugar plantations across Africa. In 2010, he was in Mali to try and finalize the country's largest foreign investment, the Makala sugar project, known as Sosuma. The plan was to lease 200 square kilometers in the country's most fertile farming region for a sugar plantation and factory. This would mean forcibly displacing thousands of local families, many of whom have farmed this land for generations. But unlike most agribusiness investors in Africa, Mima is asking these farmers to join in the scheme as contractors.
We're actually creating a new class of commercial farmers that will grow out over time.
But not everyone is enamored of the scheme. Many small farmers see this as an invasion of their way of life. The big question is, can foreign-backed agriculture be part of the solution to poverty in Africa and elsewhere?
Vandana, you are known globally, not only in your native India, but you do work with small farmers all over the world and advising governments and organisations and so on. Do you think that, by and large, emerging nations, the developing world, have got their agricultural policy right?
Well, the first thing is, people forget that 80% of the food of the world is being grown by smallholders, particularly women. We don't look at that. Secondly, the smallholder actually maximizes nutrition per acre. That land grab, I will still call it a land grab, even if the farmers are getting involved. That sugarcane will probably go to make ethanol, because in today's world, it pays more to divert food crops like soya or corn or sugarcane to run our cars than to feed people.
You're talking about biofuels here?
Yes.
Oh, you're opening up a whole can of worms.
So there are three reasons why this model will not be a solution to hunger.
So you want to leave, but are you not romanticising the small farmer and saying stay with the smallholder and just carry on with the methods that you've used for centuries?
I left physics to do work on ecological farming because I realized that there was so much manipulation of the data in agriculture. High yield seeds, actually overall per acre, less nutrition. Higher incomes for farmers. No, net income goes down. That is why the Indian farmer is committing suicide. Why are half the people in the world who are hungry?
So it's a land grab.
No, really it's not only land grab. It's a capital-intensive system of production that gets the farmer trapped in debt. So the farmer sells everything they grow to pay back the debt for chemicals and seeds, and debt is a poverty-creating mechanism. So it's a hunger-creating mechanism.
It's a lack of proper credit or
it's a lack of access to ecological agriculture knowledge. The whole world has an international assessment for agricultural science and technology report of the UN released here in Johannesburg that shows we double and triple food production by leaving agriculture in smallholders' hands, putting it in women's hands, and most importantly,
the way forward.
It is the only way forward. The UN admits it. The ISGD admits it. We can't. Agriculture left in the hands of agribusiness and Monsanto is not the way forward.
Okay, Tony Blair, your view on that? Agribusiness perhaps leads to a land grab and leave it in the hands of the smallholder?
I think it's my role of this show to respectfully disagree with Vandana there. I think you've got to start from where the facts really are. The fact is there are African countries that should be food exporters, there are food importers. There are many farmers that don't get the opportunities they have because they don't get the fertilizer and the seed and the support they need. It is a huge problem for smallholders. And I see this in the countries in which we work, where there isn't proper infrastructure, where there aren't proper roads so they can get their goods to market, and where there isn't a proper system into which they can sell their goods. So I think there is a whole series of things that, again, governments could do to ease the position of smallholders, make them more effective, make them more productive, and that's really what they want. Now, as for the agribusiness that comes in, it depends what it is. I mean, I think it's very unfair to say the guy we've just seen on the TV show, by the way, I know nothing about this project, but I think it's a bit unfair to describe him as a land grabber. I mean, it is, look, people who are coming in to invest in a country, some investment can be good, some can be bad, but we shouldn't categorize all investment that comes in as bad, and some of the intellectual capital that will come in with major companies who are able to invest in countries will do the country a lot of good and will help its development.
Well, this was the argument for Madagascar, and the government was thrown out because they handed over a billion acres.
Specific comments. It brings in innovation. It brings in much needed
But
capital.
the wrong kind of innovation. We don't need more toxics in our food. We don't need more monocultures. We don't need more farmers driven off the land.
Not everybody is bringing. Nobody's talking about GM, the Food and Agriculture Organization.
No, but the chemical fertilizers are an obsolete technology that came out of the war. There are much more sophisticated ways to renew soil fertility.
I think that one of the things I found with farmers, because I had to interact with them a lot as vice president at the bank, they really don't care so much about the ideologies. They don't care where you come out on the ideology. The farmers are asking for access to the things that would increase their productivity.
What we saw there about Mali, actually most of the agricultural wealth in Mali is in livestock. You find today that the Malians don't milk their goats, they don't milk their cattle, they are importing powdered milk from Europe. Now, who is to blame for that?
Africa imports $150 million worth of food imports every year, and yet it has more than half of the world's arable land.
It really
but
shouldn't,
it does, and people
Zainab.
go hungry.
Yes,
so
but the point,
what's that paradox?
The point you have to understand is that historically there was a shift to cash crops as a result of the era of colonialism.
But you need something to sell, don't you? You need something to sell?
And so now Africa is moving more toward the food security issues, and so the staples are becoming very important for the farmers. What you therefore need is the kind of comprehensive agriculture policy.
It's not just national policy, it's the dumping of subsidized meat and dairy products from Africa. On Africa, $400 billion is the agricultural subsidies that have been maintained in the OECD countries.
I agree.
And WTO opens up for dumping.
You know what I'm going to say, Tony Blair, as the representative here of the elements of the developed world. I mean, isn't it $75 billion worth of agricultural subsidies still in the European Union?
You know, I like to take responsibility for most things, actually, of course, people like myself have been long-time opponents, in fact, of the EU subsidy policy and the common agricultural policy, even though it's very difficult to change. But, you know, you could get rid of the EU subsidy policy and still have a problem. And that's why I'm sorry, but...
No. That there I'm going to disagree.
Okay.
The EU subsidy policy distorts. It distorts the opportunities.
But if you get rid of
it,
Tony Blair said it wouldn't solve the problem. But if you get rid of it, it wouldn't solve the problem necessarily.
It would solve some of the problem, because the issue is that the farmer needs to have the incentive on the basis of which they can overcome.
But the food is there in Africa, isn't it? Wherever you have a famine, even in Ethiopia at the height of the famine in the 80s, there was excess food production in the west of Ethiopia.
We're talking productivity,
but the food is available. It's the lack of access, the same in India.
No,
isn't it? It's the lack of
There's a very
access to the
famous
food.
Tigray project which has doubled food production through ecological methods.
But didn't Tony Blair have a point? Even if you remove the subsidies, look at India, fruit and vegetables, 40% of fruit and vegetables every year.
But that's not the story of Africa.
But that's not, but
50% of food in the industrialized countries is rotting.
But can we go back to...
Now we're losing the plot.
We're losing the plot here, are we?
Yes, can we go back to Ovi's point, which I now want to ask her, although I'm supposed to answer the question. Why are the African economies not changing their structure?
That's the point.
Well, I want the answer.
And the answer... Okay, so I would say that the basic issue has been a trap. The trap of monocultural economies, meaning that because the rent from resources enables the elite to have a good life, they often have no incentive, because the society is not demanding for measures of accountability in governance. The elite have no incentive for pursuing the kinds of policies that diversify the economy and then bring in more of the citizens to the benefits.
The situation of governance cannot and is never ever divorced from the way the economy is controlled and run. The economic elite is also the political elite that undermines democracy. So therefore, accountability is impossible, and it serves the interest of the economic elite, which is economic extraction.
The question is how you change this situation. Since I spent 10 years as UK Prime Minister, let me just tell you one thing I learned. And that is the difference between campaigning about how dreadful things are and actually taking the policy measures that change the reality. And I remember when I was trying to change the British healthcare system, and I campaigned on it and fought an election and won an election, and then I was in power, and I kept on making the speeches, and then we didn't quite change it fast enough, and then they said, well, go out and make another speech. And I said, I'm fed up with making speeches. I actually want a policy that works. So I agree with you, you've got this political and economic elite in some of these countries. But the question is, how do you change it? And you change it in part by making sure you open up the system, put in proper rules, have measures against corruption, have proper rule of law, and start to change your country. And if we don't tackle these issues, then what we end up with is a lot of campaign rhetoric that is fine and gets a round of applause but doesn't actually change anything on the ground.
When I was a student and I'm listening to Ovi, we used to say there has to be a revolution. The governance in Africa, we've had African independence for 50 years. In our own country, we've had a democratic government for 18 years. But what is changing for the people of Africa? Very little, because the elite are blocking.
And the poor everywhere, also in South
Asia. And they're
Asia,
blocking the system. But now, how do we remove this blockage?
So you're calling for a revolution, Maletsi?
No, I'm saying she is.
But Zainab,
it sounded like that.
Zainab, yeah. I have an idea of what a revolution could mean. See what has happened in the telephone sector of the telecom sector of Africa. That's a revolution. How did that happen? Because of sensible policies. Today, the best asset that the average African poor has is actually not the motorcycle, it's the telephone.
Because they use it to get prices for their commodities,
to get prices for their commodities. It helps them for health services.
Education.
It helps them in agriculture. It helps them in many myriad of life enhancement.
I should call you Comrade Obi there, calling for
I don't mind.
Revolution. So panel, just some final closing thoughts from you on our debate, why poverty, why it has persisted, and how you think we can best go forward to ensure that it doesn't stay with us. Obi.
Zainab, it's obvious that no single sector has the answer to the reduction of poverty. You need government, you need the private sector, and you need the citizens. And each of these sectors have their specific roles. But the role is played better when there is collaborative partnership between these sectors. And I would come out on the side of governments must have the right systems of governance, and they must be accountable. But above all, they must be interested in economic policies, especially social inclusive policies that share the benefits of economic growth to a larger number of their citizens. That's the way you begin to reduce poverty.
Maletsi?
Well, I think the consensus coming out of here is that we really, first and foremost, need the redistribution of political power. As long as we don't have a redistribution of political power that incorporates the people at the bottom of the pyramid, we will never overcome poverty, because the ones at the top of the pyramid want to keep it that way. So the key is redistribution of political powers, more equalization of political power in our societies, and on a global scale as well.
Vandana?
We are in the land where apartheid was created and apartheid was put behind. And we are now in a moment of human history where there's an ecological apartheid being created, where more and more of the resources that generate livelihoods and lives are being concentrated in a few hands. So the first thing we need to remove poverty is more equitable distribution of resources, whether it be land or water or seeds or biodiversity, or in the climate issue, our equal share to the atmospheric commons. Second, I do think we need to put bad measures behind us. Growth is a very, very ill-conceived measure. It worked fine for the period of war to mobilize resources for the war. It's defined on the basis of if you produce what you consume, you're not producing, which means all of Africa's production, all of women's production is written off. We need to take real production into account, and that is why so many countries are moving beyond the growth measure to well-being. And let's not forget that wealth never meant money. It meant well-being. That's where we need to move. It'll come from justice.
And Tony Blair, how can we make sure that poverty is consigned to history?
I think we should be far more practical about it. I think we should actually learn from what has worked, because not all countries have remained in the same situation in the last 30, 40 years. So the idea we can learn nothing from the way the world's developed is absurd. We've had major developments in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. Learn from them. Learn from what works and what doesn't. And realize that at the heart of this will always be politicians taking difficult decisions, but those decisions are better taken and they're more likely to lead to the outcomes we want if they're taken within systems that are democratic and accountable, that are open, that are honest, and where there is a focus on policy making that is practical and evidence-based, less about ideology, which I think is very much a 20th century thing, and far more about what actually works and how can we make that work and do the best for our people. And, you know, one of the things I again learned as Prime Minister when I was listening earlier to talking about the grassroots, that's fine. You know, people always used to say to me, listen to the people, and I would say, I am, but unfortunately they're saying different things. So it's not always easy to do that. In the end, you've got to have decision makers, but if you have a system of government that is open, honest, and effective, you're far more likely to get the decisions that benefit the people.
And a responsible private sector.
I agree with that, Obi. We've finished on a point of agreement.
Tony. Panel, thank you all very much, and indeed also to my audience here in Johannesburg. That brings us to an end to this debate on why poverty. The reasons why it still persists are clearly many and varied, but what is obvious is that there has been a collective failure to make the required effort to eradicate poverty once and for all. From me, Zainab Badawi in Johannesburg, wherever you're watching, goodbye.